Hey everyone, it's Rob. For decades, the United States has initiated regime change efforts. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump 1.0, Biden, they've all engaged in conflicts in Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. When Trump was elected last year, honestly, I was deeply concerned for a number of reasons. I don't have any political affiliation at all. But I thought if there was a silver lining, that maybe it was his promise to end America's needless wars. Perhaps he might actually stop the bloodshed in Ukraine and maybe even the onslaught in Gaza. Sadly, those conflicts have not come to an end. And now the U.S. appears to be poised to strike Venezuela. Venezuela? You might ask, why does this matter to us at Determined Truth? It's simple. We believe that Christians are called to be peacemakers, to seek justice, to defend the vulnerable, and to tell the truth. The reality is that we believe that regime change wars are rarely lead to peace. While they often enrich corporations and expand the reach of those in power, they leave nations shattered. While CEOs and political elites prosper, it's the people who suffer. It's their sons and daughters that are devastated, killed, their homes, their lands, and their futures that are destroyed. They're the ones who go to war or suffer the ravages of war. That's why we're concerned. Too many Christians appear to be supporting foreign policies without understanding the likely consequences that people will experience. So what's actually happening in Venezuela? What's driving U.S. policy? Is it really to bring an end to narco-terrorism? Is the U.S. the benevolent empire that's truly concerned about the human rights abuses of the Maduro regime? And how do we as followers of Jesus respond with wisdom, courage, and commitment to justice? To answer these questions, I'm glad to be joined by my colleague and regular colleague, Danny Hall. Danny, thank you and welcome for being
here. Good to be here again.
Thank you. As well as Miguel Tinker Salas, Professor Miguel Tinker Salas, who's a leading expert on Venezuela. Professor, thank you for being with us and welcome.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right.
Yes.
Miguel, let me go ahead and read his bio really quickly, Danny.
Yeah,
that's okay.
Go ahead for it.
So Miguel Tinker Salas is a Venezuelan-born historian, one of the leading scholars on modern Latin America, and particularly Venezuela's political history, culture, and the transformative impact of the oil industry. He's now Professor Emeritus of History at Pomona College, where he taught since 1993. Professor Salas earned his PhD at UC San Diego. He's authored several influential books, including The Enduring Legacy, Oil, Culture, and Society in Venezuela, as well as Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. And he's also co-edited the book, Venezuela, Hugo Chavez and the Decline of an Exceptional Democracy. His work combines deep archival research with personal insight into the Venezuelan society, making him a sought-after commentator on the country's contemporary crisis, U.S.-Latin American relations, and the broader forces shaping the region. Again, Professor Salas, welcome. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, we're delighted to have you. We have so much we can learn about this as it's become such an important issue right now in our country. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your career, and then maybe begin to help us understand Venezuela as a country and the people.
I was born in Venezuela. My parents worked for the American Oil Company, Standard Oil Company of New Jersey. Today, you know it as ExxonMobil. Venezuela, since 1914, was a source of oil supplied primarily to the United States. By 1922, it had discovered one of the largest oil wells in the region, spewing over 100,000 barrels a day. And that put Venezuela on the map and attracted oil companies from the U.S. and Europe, from England and the Dutch as well. So you had Shell, you had Standard Oil, you had ExxonMobil. My parents worked for both of them, for those companies. Wow. And I was raised in what was at that time known as an oil camp, which was a effort to emulate an American town, an American city, for its American employees. So you had your own private school, your own private commissary, your own private club. You had a series of efforts to recreate hometown USA. Although the majority of Americans were from Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana, oil-producing states. So there was a southern flair to the sense of the oil camps. My education was both in Venezuela and the U.S. I attended University of California, San Diego for a BA, MA, and PhD. I was told initially, don't study Venezuela. No one cares about it. This is back in the 1980s. Nothing happens there. All they have is oil, a few beauty queens, and a good, a handful of baseball players. So my first work was on Mexico. I wrote a book on Sonora, called Under the Shadow of the Eagles, Sonora and the Transformation of the Border during the Porfiriato. And it has a chapter on Arizona, Southern Arizona and Tucson, and the relationship between Southern Arizona and Mexico. I worked at Arizona State for 4 years and then took a job at Pomona College in 1993.
Wow, excellent, excellent. Thank you. So tell us a little bit more now about Venezuela, the country, the people. What's it like?
Maybe you want to show the little clip you mentioned, and then we can go from there.
Okay, great. Let me do that.
Venezuela is the northernmost country in South America, possessing diverse environments. Its population is an amalgam of indigenous, African, and Spanish, with an influx of Italians and Portuguese, as well as thousands of Middle Eastern migrants. During its early existence, the country produced cacao beans. In the early 19th century, coffee became the dominant export product. By the early 1900s, both British and U.S. companies began to explore for oil. Oil and the profits that it generated gradually transformed politics and society. During the World War II, the country played a key role providing oil to the Allied nations. U.S. presence in the country expanded, including military missions, as well as thousands of expats who worked in the oil industry. January 58 introduced a democratic period. Left forces that had been involved in the ouster of the dictator were not included in the new arrangement. Some of them rebelled, joined a guerrilla movement that bedeviled the country for decades. As early as 1974, a National Security Council document concluded that if significant economic change did not take place, a social revolt loomed on the horizon. Despite rising inequality, the democratic government survived, earning the label of the model democracy in Latin America. In 1989, the government attempted to impose austerity measures. The country exploded in a popular rebellion. Hugo Chavez, a lieutenant colonel, rode the wave of social discontent and was elected president in 1997. Chavez asserted state control over the national oil company, a policy that was adamantly opposed by the opposition and eventually resorted to a coup against him in 2002. Broad segments of the population and even the military opposed the coup and returned Chavez to power. Chavez also charted a new course in foreign relations, challenging U.S. hegemony in Latin America. The U.S. increasingly saw him as a principal adversary in the region. He asked his followers to vote for his vice president, Nicolás Maduro, in the event of his death. Maduro was elected in early 2014. In March of 2015, President Obama declared Venezuela a national security threat to the U.S. and imposed sanctions on individuals. Worsened conditions in the country forced millions of Venezuelans to migrate. Immigration dramatically transformed the country. 6 to 8 million people leaving the country is now in reverse. People have found that the border is no longer accessible. Opportunities elsewhere are no longer available and are beginning to return to Venezuela, finding many of the conditions that they left previously. The first Trump administration imposed sanctions on oil sales. The Biden administration eased sanctions somewhat, expecting that Maduro would allow elections in 2024. Maduro and the government expected that the election would legitimate its rule. In fact, it did the opposite, because as a result of the election and the inability to provide the tally sheets, there was a discrepancy between what the government was saying and what the opposition was arguing. The election lacked legitimacy. The sanctions were reintroduced. The current Trump administration has fluctuated between engagement and a military option, imposing a naval flotilla in the Caribbean and trying to link Venezuela to drug trafficking, asserting the unilateral right to bomb coastal vessels. Venezuela continues to be a vibrant country with people who are not simply defined by the conflict between Washington and Caracas. Venezuela is the northernmost.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
So just taking off on the clip, Venezuela was actually encountered by Columbus on his third voyage on the eastern part of Venezuela. But since it lacked a large indigenous population, since it lacked, obviously, big, large urban areas, cities, since it lacked large amounts of gold, it did not attract too much attention from the Spanish. And it was largely on the periphery of what at that time would have been the colonial centers of Mexico and Peru, which were the large dominant areas where the Spanish established their presence. What it did have very early on was oil. The Spanish encountered oil, but what do you do with oil in 1500? You don't have an internal combustion engine. You don't have a motor. You don't have anything to propel. They use oil. So they used oil for caulking boats. They used oil or the crude for covering roofs. But they had no commercial value because you didn't have the internal combustion engine. You didn't have It didn't provide a remedy. I think they took some oil back to the King of Spain, who used it for arthritis on his leg, but that didn't work very well either. So again, the Venezuela from its very early on had the presence of oil, but again, oil did not really become an important factor until you began to have the internal combustion engine, until you began to have need for oil, primarily to asphalt the streets or to propel motor vehicles. But the big real important change is when the British Navy shifted from steam engines to internal combustion engines. And now the boats could use, the ships could use oil. And that really propelled the search for oil in Venezuela.
When did that take place? When did that transition take place?
The first decade of the 20th century.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So what is the motivating factor then? I mean, you talked about narco terrorism in the video a little bit there, and that seems to be the rhetoric of the Trump administration today is we have to go in and stop the narco terrorists because they're making America unsafe. What is really going on there in terms of the political dynamics that is attracting so much interest from the United States and the Western empires?
Well, the narco terrorism is a lever that's being used to create the context for the intervention. But the reality is that Venezuela produces no fentanyl. Fentanyl has precursor chemicals. Those precursor chemicals from China, which is on the Pacific side. Venezuela's in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. So none of the precursor chemicals come to Venezuela. There are no laboratories. I mean, I always joked a bit when I thought of Trump asking the generals, where are the labs? And they telling him, well, there are no labs because they don't produce fentanyl. What does happen is that neighboring Colombia produces cocaine, and between about 7% of the cocaine is trafficked through Venezuela through organized crime. There is no evidence that the government traffics the cocaine. There is no evidence. But here's where the opposition in Venezuela learned its lesson from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, so that they mimicked what they thought the U.S. would be interested in learning about. That is, Venezuela is a narco-terrorist state. So they developed the dialogue, the narrative that the Venezuelan government was a narco-terrorist state in order to assuage the U.S. government, in order to induce intervention, because the reality is that it is not a major producer of any drugs. Some of it is trafficked, but according to U.S. intelligence, less than 7%. And it doesn't have fentanyl. It doesn't produce fentanyl. So in that sense, we find ourselves at odds with the reality. The reality is at odds with the position established by the U.S. government in terms of narco-terrorism. It doesn't exist. There's no basis for it. Now they've begun to alter that discourse because they recognize that there's a gap in their argument, talking about how, the oil is being used by Hezbollah. It's being used by Hamas. It's being used. So now we're switching. Now we're switching. But this is what happens when the opposition, lacking a clear argument in terms of narco-terrorism, then switches to another topic that might attract the U.S. administration and their interest. As an argument. So when the ship was interdicted a few days ago, the skipper, the tanker carrying close to $80 million worth of oil was seized. They said that oil was going to support Hezbollah. That oil was going to support, again, looking for another rationale. So they're searching for rationales, and when the reality is that the context for Venezuela is much different.
Let me ask you a couple of clarifying questions, just for my sake and for those who might be listening as well. Describe for us, when you kept using the opposition, we have very little understanding of the political mechanisms of the country, the history. You're in the video, it talks about the era of democracy, and then you have Chavez and Maduro following that, and all the back and forth during that thing. Describe for us a little bit about the political situation, maybe a brief history. And when you say the opposition, who are these people, and what's the current state of that?
Okay. Venezuela, after 1958, as you saw in the video, entered into a democratic period. Before that, the country had been governed by a succession of military leaders, largely from the Andean state of Táchira. So these were all generals from the one state which bordered Colombia. In 1945 to 48, there was a brief democratic period. But by 53, by 48, it was back into a military dictatorship that lasted until 1958. In that time period, a pacted democracy was formed. That is an agreement between three dominant political parties: Acción Democrática, URD, and COPEI. I'll tell you in a second what they were. Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and mild social democrats. They formed an alliance indicating that they would not rely on the military to resolve their differences. They would accept the results of the ballot box, but they would never involve the left in any of their governments, even though the left had played a role in ousting the dictator. That pushed the left into assuming a position of belligerence because they had been excluded from the government process. And that's why I mentioned some of them eventually became part of a guerrilla movement. But the country nonetheless proceeded along a democratic path. The US supported that government, viewed it as a model democracy, viewed it as a country that others should emulate because it allowed for foreign oil corporations to function in the country. It allowed it to repatriate the wealth derived in Venezuela, and it did not nationalize the oil company. Remember, Mexico had nationalized oil in 1938. Venezuela had not nationalized oil, and when it eventually did nationalize in 1976, it was fully compensated. So that Standard Oil Company, Shell, others were fully compensated, even though their investment had received had benefited multiple times already, had multiplied itself multiple times.
Okay.
That pacted democracy became riddled with corruption, inefficiency, and by 1989, when they attempted to impose strident structural adjustment policies, neoliberal economic policies, there was a revolt. And you saw that on the clip as well. That revolt produced dissidents within the military and also a break in the arrangement between the political parties that eventually led to a coup led by, of all people, Hugo Chavez in 1992. And that coup eventually, he took responsibility. He emerged as an important figure. He took responsibility. He said his famous quote, "We have failed for now." The military regretted ever having allowed him to speak publicly after that. And the country then was confronted with a democratic crisis. The model wasn't functioning. And by 1998, now we had a new election, and Chavez was a candidate. And it was the beauty and the beast, because the beauty was a woman who was running, was a Miss Venezuela, a Miss Universe, Irene Science, against the beast, which was Hugo Chavez. And she was leading in the polls, but her association with the old order cost her politically, and Chavez began to take the lead. The opposition, the parties all united behind a person named Salas Romer, who then competed against Chavez and lost, and Chavez was democratically elected and assumed the presidency in 1999. So when I say opposition, I mean those people after 1999 opposed to Hugo Chavez. And they control the discourse, the dialogue. They would have us believe that every election since Chavez has been rigged, when in fact Chavez was elected multiple times in what most observers report were fair elections. The election that is in question is the 2024 election, which we can get into later on.
Okay, all right. So we'll maybe go back to that, but let's also, if it's not narco-terrorism, and if that's just simply a fabricated reason for justifying U.S. intervention, is it oil, or is it that simple, or are there other interests that are going on that are driving the United States policy to say, we've got to take care of Venezuela?
Well, I think the U.S. is looking at a Latin America that has changed dramatically in the last 25 years. Yeah. That Latin America used to be much more subservient in its position vis-a-vis the U.S. That Latin America with Chavez, you had the beginning of a political process that led to the left winning elections in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, and more recently Colombia, and more recently Mexico as well. So the U.S. began to be displaced in Latin America. It saw Venezuela as the culprit, and U.S. administration after administration targeted Venezuela, whether it was Bush 1, Bush 2. They talked about very clearly, Colin Powell and company talked about inoculating Latin America from the the infirmity that was in Venezuela.
Okay.
They also supported the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez, blaming him for the coup, a coup that eventually failed, and he was returned to the power by the military itself. Obama also ratcheted up by placing Venezuela on the sanction list, saying it was a clear and present danger to the U.S., even though its air force is limited, its navy can't reach beyond the shoreline. It did not represent a clear and present danger. He had just opened relations up with Cuba, and he wanted to throw red meat to the conservatives. So the same day that he talked about traveling to Cuba, he also then said Venezuela will be sanctioned because it represents a clear and present danger. The first Trump administration imposed maximum pressure. That was the name of their policy. They opted to recognize an individual named Juan Guaido as the interim president.
Yeah.
He was supported by 60 other countries as well. Today, Juan Guaido sits in Miami and supported by we don't know who. So that policy.
Marco Rubio. I mean, is that?
Well, there's a question here about who supports these opposition leaders.
Okay.
Because some of them living in Madrid, some are living in Bogota, some are living in the Dominican Republic, others in Miami. It's unclear where the resources came from.
Okay.
What is clear is that the Venezuelan oil company Citgo, which had refineries in the U.S., it was then placed under trusteeship and has been ordered sold. There was also money that was missing that was given to the opposition leadership that has never been accounted for. We're talking millions and millions by the Trump administration who supported Guaido, and that still remains an unopened box. The Trump administration employed maximum pressure. Now, with Secretary Rubio as Secretary of State, as an advocate for regime change in Venezuela, we see the policy ratcheted up to try to affect regime change that was incomplete in the first Trump administration.
So just to clarify again, if the Americans now for a number of administrations, a number of decades, has positioned Venezuela as a national security threat, what is the essence of the threat?
Right.
The threat, at one level, the threat is that it was the leader of a movement for a multipolar world. That is, that it wanted to decenter the U.S. as the center of relations. Most countries in Latin America pursued policies during the Cold War that made anti-communism the cornerstone of foreign policy, and also privileged the U.S. into a position of dominance in the region. With Chavez, you had the proposal to form the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations that didn't include the U.S. It had the position to form the Union of South American Nations, to move South America in the direction of a European Union with a common passport, a common currency, a common investment policy, a common environmental strategy and policy, which didn't include the U.S. So therefore, Venezuela became the nemesis, became the opponent of the U.S. hegemony.
Yeah.
In that time period, other countries have stepped in. China has begun to fill that vacuum, so that today China is the number one economic trading partner for most of South America. It buys almost wholesale the agricultural production from Argentina. It does the same thing for Chile and mineral products. It does the same thing for Brazil. It is the leading trading partner. It has opened up a deep water port on the Peruvian coast, a country that is very close to the U.S., but China has a presence there. So the U.S. would like to, if we saw the national security strategy document that was released last week, which talks about a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, we'll see that what the U.S. seeks to do now is reassert itself politically, militarily, and talks about how the resources of Latin America are the legacy of the U.S. They belong to the U.S., and that the U.S. would move to curtail other countries from attempting to utilize those resources. So in that sense, that's the danger that the U.S. presents itself as Venezuela. It's not a military challenge. It's not a military threat. It is an example, but an example that has been tainted in the last 5 years.
Okay, I got two directions I want to go. Let me go in one of those directions then. So this is about a U.S. hegemony in the area, the Monroe Doctrine. We need to have control over this region, and Venezuela is the leading threat to that control and power. But Maduro, if I'm not mistaken, just the other day, I'm sure you're aware, came out and said, hey, essentially, well, we're calling on the BRICS nations to have our back. And is there a danger then that if the U.S. doesn't back down, that this could escalate to something pretty serious, not just a superpower attacking Venezuela, but a superpower attacking other superpowers?
I don't think that, although Brazil, Russia, China, India have been critical of U.S. military strategy in Latin America, and in particular the deployment of the ships off the coast of Venezuela, they are not going to militarily intervene.
Okay.
They are not going to militarily engage.
Would that include not supplying them with weaponry, or not engaging just militarily with themselves?
They will at this point not supply them with weapons and will not militarily engage themselves. So I think in that sense, it's a solidarity. It's an expression of solidarity. It's an expression. Mexico has expressed that opposition. So has Chile, so has Brazil. Lula recently, in a conversation with Trump a couple of days ago, offered to mediate the crisis. Colombia offered to mediate the crisis. Qatar has been involved in attempting to mediate the crisis. But it's kind of hard to mediate the crisis when Trump says Venezuela is targeted now. Colombia, you could be next. Mexico, you could be next. Right. So it kind of pulls the rug out from underneath any negotiated efforts or any efforts at trying to de-escalate the crisis. And that's clear if one reads Mark Esper's book. He was Secretary of Defense and Trump won. He actually talks about how Trump suggested launching Tomahawk missiles against Mexico, targeting so-called drug laboratories. So this is something he's talked about in the context of Venezuela now, and also in the context of Colombia now. But getting back to the question you raised earlier, is it about oil? Oil is a factor, as we saw in the seizure of the ship off the coast of Venezuela. Venezuela possesses the largest reserves of oil in the world. 303 billion barrels of oil, more than Saudi Arabia, more than the Gulf states. And it right now is producing less than 1 million barrels a day. But it was at one time producing 3.5, nearing 4 million barrels a day. It could return to that. Venezuela has a particular kind of oil. It's a heavy crude oil with high content of sulfur, which means that it requires a specific kind of refining. Where are those refineries at? They're in Houston. They're in Louisiana, because of the historic relationship going back to the 30s and 40s and 50s. Most of the refineries that were capable of refining Venezuelan heavy crude were in the U.S., because to refine heavy crude, you have to dilute it with other sources of oil in order to produce a light crude that is sold and processed for gasoline. So that heavy crude is a fact. The crude oil is a factor. It may not be the only driving factor, but it is a factor, as we saw with the confiscation of the boat recently. And let me suggest that if that policy is applied further, that is, if other ships, other tankers are to be seized, that will strangle the Venezuelan economy. And the people who will pay the price are the poor. The elites are not going to give up power because you strangle the economy. That's been happening for the last 15 years with sanctions already. So that the people who will pay the price are the poor. And if you want us to stop migration, that's not the policy to adopt, because that's precisely the policy of sanctions, which has propelled the migration in the last 10 years, forcing almost 8 million Venezuelans to leave Venezuela and seek settlement in Colombia, in Chile, and Mexico, and in the U.S.
You know, one of the go ahead, Rob.
I was going to ask one other question in another direction then, and that is, are there legitimate human rights violations happening under the Maduro regime? And that's one of the things that we're hearing is that the United Nations, human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, they've all condemned Venezuela for the lack of human rights. The injustices, torture, ill treatment, detentions, beatings, things like that. Are those things? Is that That's one question, and a subsidiary question is, if that's if that really is happening, why didn't Trump use that as the reason for going into Venezuela instead of narco-terrorism? You may not even want to answer.
He supports the governments that are authoritarian elsewhere.
Right?
He
Yeah.
supports. I mean,
Well,
he just had the head
Yeah.
of Saudi Arabia visiting the White House, who has been pointed out to by U.S. intelligence as the directed murdering a Washington Post journalist.
yeah, Khashoggi. Yeah.
Where you have no elections, where you have authoritarian governments. If he was to use authoritarianism and human rights, he would have to then turn the image in another direction and look at all his allies who are authoritarian, who violate human rights. And the other issue about the drug as a pretext, in the middle of condemning Venezuela as a narco-terrorist, he just pardoned the former president of
Exactly.
Honduras,
Yeah, I know,
Honduras.
it's crazy.
Hernandez, who was convicted in a U.S. court by a U.S. jury of trafficking 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S. and of saying, "I want to shove the cocaine up Americans' nostrils." This is the person he pardoned, and when asked about the pardon, he says, "I don't know anything about it," but he pardoned him. So there's a contradiction there. Now, are there human rights abuses in Venezuela? Yes. Has the government become authoritarian? Yes. Does that need to be addressed? Yes. But I think that the context for that is not a war. The context for that is promoting reforms. And if you want to go straight to the next question, was the 2024 election suspect? Yes, it is suspect because the government never provided the tally sheets. And had they had the tally sheets, they would have provided them. So the election is put into question primarily because of the government's own inability. They claim that their system was hacked by a hacking group in northern Macedonia, which again provides no evidence. Is a nice outlet, but provides no evidence. So yes, there is an argument to be made that the government has become more authoritarian, that it unleashed violence against those protests in the elections in July of 2024 and in August of 2024, and it should be held accountable for that.
Let me ask, so if there was, it seemed to be, if this was a tainted election and the results were tainted, that means that there were perhaps a clear majority of Venezuelans who would like to have a different government in place and would have elected a different government. But then you have this whole specter of the U.S. intervention. How does the average Venezuelan feel about all that? They seem to have at least a huge portion of the population discontent with their own government, and yet then there's our intervention that poses a different kind of specter over the country. What does the average Venezuelan person think about what's going on? Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I speak to people in Venezuela on a regular basis, and the society continues. I mean, most what I'm hearing is people have lost faith in both the government and the opposition. They're tired of the polarization. They're tired of the context in which it operates. They're obviously concerned about the deployment of the fleet off the coast of Venezuela, but they continue their lives on a normal basis. They're preparing for Christmas. They're out shopping. They're watching a baseball game. Life has not come to a paralysis in Venezuela. Life has continued its pace in Venezuela. What they're concerned about is the potential recession. If you begin seizing ships off the coast of Venezuela that are carrying these products for sale abroad, the reality is that will induce a recession, that will induce hyperinflation, that will mean that there will be an inability to provide for their own necessities. That's what concerns them the most, I think, in the long term. So I think that, again, this policy of seizing tankers is counterproductive. If you think it's going to overthrow Maduro, then the crisis over the last 10 years would have done that. Remember, Venezuela had one of the highest inflation rates in the world in the modern era, if not the highest inflation rate in the world in the modern era. And it still did not move Maduro. Instead, it moved 8 million people out of the country.
Wow. So impoverishing the people even further, which the sanctions are already doing, is only going to drive Maduro's narrative and reinforce his reign as the evil empires over there, not us. We're trying to help you. Is that fair?
And yeah, it's fair, and it will also put the onus on the opposition. Maria Corina Machado has said
Yeah.
she supports the U.S. intervention in Venezuela. Maria Corina Machado has not been very clear on the deportation of the 600,000 Venezuelans who lost their TPS status in the U.S. and are being deported to Venezuela, and now the seizure of the tanker. If she she supports that, she will find herself losing support in Venezuela, because again, that's an onerous position to withhold, because again, the persons who are going to suffer the consequences of that will be the common folk, not elites in Venezuela. Right. They, as they do everywhere else, will find ways to survive.
Now, she's the she's the one that won the Nobel Peace Prize, but go ahead,
she's the one that won the Nobel Peace Prize that surprised many people, because in Venezuela, she had supported insurrection.
She's not in support of peace. She won
in 2018, so that it's hard to square peace with insurrection.
Yeah.
It's this whole thing's fascinating and so complex. The narrative that we hear constantly in the States is this thriving democracy, this thriving country that was prosperous. It's these regimes that we are now opposing that are responsible for the economic collapse. That it's a proof that they're always labeled socialist, that they nationalize these things. And so it's the government of Venezuela, particularly under Chavez and Maduro, that are responsible for the economic collapse and the pressure. You're saying that's, where do you see that? Is it so complex that there's all these factors are in play, or how do you?
Well, no, actually, I would take us back tonight to why did Venezuelans vote for Hugo Chavez if things were so great? He promised to upend all the arrangements. He promised to rewrite the Constitution. He promised to challenge neoliberal economic policy. He challenged the U.S.'s role in Venezuela. Again, what is missing out of there, the discourse that we're hearing about everything was fine before Chavez, is that it wasn't. Poverty was 80% in some cases. Okay. Severe poverty was even higher. The reality was the political system had collapsed. People had lost faith in the political system. They had lost faith in the political parties, Acción Democrática, COPEI, URD, or a whole slew of other parties that were being formed. That's why they voted for Chavez and continue to vote for Chavez throughout much of the 21st century up until this moment, until 2013 when he died. So the reality is, a bit more complicated than we're being led to believe. That's why you had the left winning in every country, most countries in South America, except for Peru. And even there was a slight reformer that got elected.
Okay. So what I'm hearing a little bit, just to clarify and take us to the end here, is that a lot of the turmoil that's being caused partly on the sanctions, that's driving the economic inequity and forcing people for migration. You made that comment there. What would a just and constructive response be? What should we as American Christian leaders be advocating for, be telling our people, our constituents, hey, this might be the best solution here. Watch out for this, but here's the path forward.
Well, the policy that does the least amount of harm to the poorest of the poor in Latin America or in Venezuela, one that stays away from foreign intervention. Can you imagine what would be the impact of a full-blown invasion in Venezuela? Right. I'm not predicting what would happen, because I think it's impossible. We don't have a crystal ball, but we know that it would not be an easy proposition. We know that the 15,000 Marines that are sitting off the coast would not be sufficient to control a country that is the size of Venezuela, with 31 million inhabitants. And interesting, though, in my research in the National Archives, I did find 3 plans to invade Venezuela from 1941, I think 46 and 48.
Wow.
Devised by the U.S. military, and they centered on oil. They all
you figure oil was,
and access to oil. But again, an invasion would be disastrous for Venezuela, as it would for the U.S. It would destabilize the entire of Latin America. It would destabilize the Caribbean. It might or might not lead to prolonged conflict. But here's the question I always ask: is those who want change, what are they? The day Maduro's ousted tomorrow, what is their policy for day one? What is
Exactly.
their policy? What are they proposing? Is it revenge, or is it some kind of national reconciliation? What is it?
Yeah.
Those are terms that are very important, because again, to continue down the path of polarization may lead to a civil conflict none of us want to see. And I think the most important thing is to pursue policies that are cognizant of the importance of doing the least amount of damage possible.
Yeah. It looks like you're heading towards another Iraq, right?
I don't see it as another Iraq precisely,
Okay.
but it has potential of a long, prolonged conflict, because you have on the western border, you have Colombia, you have guerrillas that are still not been demobilized there, that have been part of the long-term conflict with Colombia. So that the cost could be an insurrection. The country is very diverse. It has dense tropical rainforest. It has broad coastal surfaces. So that, again, it's unclear what that context might look like.
Okay.
It's hard to predict an Afghan in Iraq, or a Panama, or others. But all that highlights is U.S. intervention does not work. The record of U.S. intervention in terms of regime change and nation building has been horrendous, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, which is still a major source of conflict, whether it was Guatemala or Nicaragua. Regime change and nation building has not been the U.S. forte.
Is diplomacy an option? I mean, is it a viable option?
I think it is. I mean, Petro has come up, the president of Colombia has suggested another re-election, an election which would be overseen by international monitors. I think those are the kinds of discussions and issues on the table that need to be addressed to find a peaceful solution to this crisis, one that comes from Venezuelans themselves, is imposed, because there's a business of the opposition. I mean, there are people who are in the opposition for whom being in the opposition is a good business.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's true everywhere.
They've made a life making profits off of being in the opposition. They're selling Venezuelan assets abroad. They're unable to account for money that was given to them by the U.S. government, as we saw in Iraq, where there was billions and billions that are still unaccounted for, as we saw in Afghanistan.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. You're a wealth of knowledge. You're a gentleman and a scholar, and we appreciate you giving us the time
thank you so much.
to help us understand, and hopefully that we can do a good job of taking this to our constituents and hopefully just advocating for the people, advocating for change for the sake of the people, instead of empire and power and corporate greed and those things there. So we want to thank you so much for your time, and we just appreciate you coming on and joining us.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. I appreciate the opportunity to engage in a conversation and the opportunity to explain this complicated issue to you and your fellow listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Yeah.